So, what's harder, Japanese or Chinese? What a question, we've got a lot to unpack, let's go. Hello noble ones and welcome to Metatron's Academy, the channel where we explore how to learn languages in the most fun and effective way possible. This question, what's harder, Japanese or Chinese, is actually a very common question. It comes up not only to me as a language teacher and also as someone who has reached a reasonable level in both Japanese and Chinese, but also on Google and several search engines. So I would like to address this question by looking at what people say and what answers we get on Google. Chinese versus Japanese, which is easier opti-lingo? The answer is, Japanese is slightly easier to learn, but Chinese is much more widely spoken. Both languages have their pros and cons. Ultimately, whichever language pulls on your heartstrings the most is the winner. Ignoring the very beginning for a second before we deep dive, I'd like to say that of course the second part, the latter part of this message, makes absolute sense. If the reason behind this question is, which one should I choose, then I absolutely agree with this person. You shouldn't let the difficulty of a language be the ultimate factor in what you wish to start and try to learn. Absolutely choose the one you like the most. We have another one, let's check it out. Related questions, which is harder, Chinese or Japanese? Chinese and Japanese are two of the most popular languages to learn. Japanese is generally seen as being harder than Chinese due to its writing system and complex grammar structures. So already we see that we have a little bit of a problem here. The first two answers are complete opposites. One says the Japanese is easier, one says the Japanese is harder. So which one is correct? Well, already I think the fact that the answers and opinions that you find on this topic on the internet is a veritable cornucopia already is an answer in of it itself. In the sense that we can see that which one is perceived harder or easier depends. Depending on where you're from, what your first language is this your second language, do you have experience with languages? Maybe you have a good ear, maybe you don't. But on this video, I don't just want to leave it at that. I don't just want to say, well, it depends what language you speak and it depends if you have a good ear or not. I want to go deeper. I want to examine the answer at a deeper level and do a so-called comparative analysis. Whenever we think about learning or studying a language, we think of it as a whole unit. I'm trying to learn Chinese. Is it hard? Is it easy? But the reality is that the moment you start diving into what it means to learn a language, you'll notice that each language has so many layers and so many different aspects, and they cannot all be classified as this is easy, this is hard, at a universal level, including the entirety of the language. For instance, you can have a language that is particularly easy to speak but extremely hard to write, and of course vice versa. So today, as we embark in our quest to find the definitive answer to this question, we will examine the following aspects: pronunciation, grammar, sentence structure, reading, writing, the average learning curve when it comes to the European frame of reference, from A1 to C2 levels, overall syntax, synonyms. There is a lot to say. But I think the first thing we need to do in order to be able to gain a proper answer is to define the question. When you say, what's harder to learn, Japanese or Chinese, which type of Chinese are you talking about? Are you comparing it with Mandarin spoken in mainland China, Taiwanese Mandarin, Cantonese? This is all Chinese. And they are quite different, even when it comes to the overall level of difficulty. Cantonese Chinese, for instance, has a lot more tones than Mandarin. When it comes to the writing system, for example, the sort of Mandarin that is spoken as an official language in the Republic of China makes use of simplified characters, whereas if you want to learn Taiwanese, well, they still use traditional characters, which are a lot more complex and introduce a completely different level of difficulty. Japanese, when it comes to the writing system, is kind of in between, a little more closer to Taiwanese, but kind of in between. I'll tell you more about it once we reach the writing section of this video. And even though both mainland Chinese and Taiwanese Chinese both use Mandarin, the pronunciation is different, and even the tones are different. Just to give you one example, there is a heavy usage of neutral tones in standard Mandarin, mostly in the northern variety of mainland China, whereas neutral tones are almost non-existent in Taiwanese, and they are supplanted by first tones. But to be fair, most people who say Chinese, in the majority of cases, they mean the Putonghua, so the standard language spoken in the Republic of China. So let's compare that to Japanese, and then I'll make a dedicated video where I compare Taiwanese to Japanese. And of course I can compare Taiwanese Guoyu to Republic of China Putonghua if you're interested. Let's begin with the pronunciation. A lot of the times when you read people talking about Japanese and Chinese, the majority of people will tell you, well, Japanese is very easy, it has a very simple pronunciation, whereas Chinese is obviously it's a tonal language and that makes it infinitely more complicated when it comes to its pronunciation and the rules you need to learn. Now, even though this is a true answer, it is a very superficial one. First and foremost, and what I'm about to say is kind of funny, but the majority of people that I've noticed say the Japanese pronunciation is easy don't have a very good pronunciation in Japanese. Now, given, I'm not saying that they are not intelligible. I don't know, they are absolutely intelligible, and they're not as bad as someone who speaks with a thickest possible accent like arigato. And of course they tend to be better, but oftentimes, because these are people that haven't spent a lot of time in the study of the language, of course there is a Dunning-Kruger effect in place, and they really think they're amazing, whereas they tend to be average. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that yes, if your goal as you are learning Japanese is communication, you just want to be clearly understood and you don't want to sound too much like a foreigner, then sure, Japanese pronunciation is not that complicated. Particularly if you come from a Romance language. If you're an Anglophone, you might need to work on your vowels a bit more than, say, a Spanish speaker or an Italian speaker. With that being said, if you want to sound as close to a native as possible, then Japanese brings to the table a very complicated thing called the pitch accent. And of course I'll make a dedicated video to the, let's call it, controversial topic of the pitch accent in Japanese. But it's definitely something that adds an incredible layer of difficulty to the study of Japanese. Is it necessary? No, unless you want to sound like a native, but many people do. And often many people think they do, even though they haven't studied pitch accent and so they don't. So if we do insert pitch accent and we're talking about a deep, extensive understanding of Japanese pronunciation, then I'm still gonna say that Chinese is harder, but Japanese is not simple by any stretch of the definition of that word. With that being said, in Mandarin, whether you want to sound like a native or you're only interested in communicating with people, you still have to master the tones at an extremely high level, otherwise they won't have a clue what you're on about. Which means that however you want to look at it, Mandarin does bring to the table a higher level of difficulty when it comes to pronunciation. Of course, how much of a problem that is will depend entirely on you. If you have a very good ear and an excellent teacher, you might overcome the problem of tones altogether in a few weeks. But if you do not have a good ear and you do not have a good teacher and you're just trying to learn it on your own, then learning Chinese might become absolutely impossible. Stress on the good teacher, bad teacher part, because that's really the part that matters the most. But yes, when it comes to pronunciation, I think it's fair to say that Chinese is harder, but it's not fair to say that Japanese is easy at all. When it comes to grammar, then the situation sort of changes the other way around, in the sense that at a general level, then yes, I want to say pretty confidently Japanese is harder than Chinese because they conjugate more, and also because they have the less commonly used subject-object-verb, whereas Chinese follows a subject-verb-object like English or Italian. With that being said, Chinese isn't easy when it comes to forming a sentence and understand them in context. That is because even though they don't conjugate as much as the Japanese do, and they don't have all of the different layers and levels of registers and honorific this and keigo and sonkeigo and kenjogo and tenego than the Japanese have, Chinese is extremely complicated because of this. In order to be able to start understanding Chinese, you'll have to memorize a huge level of expressions and words that sound absolutely nothing like anything you have ever spoken. The metadata accumulation is over the top. If your language is a agglutinative polysyllabic language, then I suppose you would be more close to how Japanese forms sentences, as Chinese is a lot more of a isolating language. And even though both languages have a huge, enormous number of homophones, so words that sound just the same but have different meaning that you'll have to figure out through context, Chinese has more than Japanese does because Chinese words tend to be shorter, 1 or 2 syllables at most in the majority of cases, whereas Japanese tends to have a lot more syllables, which allows more variety in the overall language. So your ability to be able to understand what people are saying is going to be harder in Chinese and harder to reach a so-called tipping point whereby you really feel like you're making progress than in Japanese. Now, talking about the writing system, this is a big one because whenever we talk about the writing system, we also have to consider it together with the reading and how it works in these languages. And the thing is that Chinese, in my experience, is a lot easier to read and write than Japanese. And that's not just because of the simplified characters. In fact, even if we were talking about traditional characters, I would find Chinese easier to read, not necessarily to write, because the Japanese, even though they still use a lot of traditional characters, they have also gone through a certain level of simplification, not as much as they did in the 50s in China, but they did simplify a little bit. And so, in other words, you have simplified characters for the Republic of China, you've got Japanese, which has simplified a few and kind of removed the most difficult ones, but kept the majority at a traditional sense, and then you've got like Hong Kong, Taiwan, which kept the real traditional characters, which are So writing is going to be harder in the latter, but when it comes to reading, Japanese is absolutely insane. In other words, it makes no logical sense. And this is coming from someone who has learned over 2,000 characters, or kanji, in Japanese. In the majority of cases in Chinese, when you read a character and you learn that, for example, this character is read what, then great. That's how that character is going to be read, no matter what. Now, given tones do affect each other and modulate depending on which tone precedes what other tone, so the tone situation does need some study, but once you learn this character has this sound, in the majority of cases, whenever you see it, no matter where it is in the sentence, you'll know that's the sound that character makes. Good luck doing that with Japanese, where kanji can have 7, 14 different pronunciations. Not that all of those are used, but it's really difficult when you're seeing a Japanese kanji for the first time in a sentence, particularly if it's a subsection of multiple kanjis. It's really difficult to guess. I think it's gonna be pronunciation number 5. So in my experience, learning to read Japanese has been a lot harder than learning to read Chinese. That doesn't make learning to read Chinese easy though. They're both very difficult. But of course, a good thing about Japanese is that you don't write it just using kanji. You usually have a lot of hiragana syllables, and that kind of helps you space out when you're trying to read what a noun is, what a particle is, what a verb is. Whereas in Chinese, since they only use characters, then that can become a little more confusing. So pros and cons, I suppose. I would still vouch for Chinese being easier to read and write than Japanese, however. Another problem is the usage of foreign words. You see, in Japanese, I think the Japanese really like using English words. Of course, they butcher the pronunciation and they transform McDonald's into McDonaldo. But with that being said, they still use a lot of English words within their vocabulary. They just pronounce them in katakana. Chinese, instead, it's like they have an absolute rejection to using foreign words. It doesn't necessarily have to be political. It probably has to do with the fact that their pronunciation is very different from the way we pronounce, and when I say we, I really mean non-Chinese, pronounce words and create syllables. But you will have situations whereby in Japanese, if you're trying to learn the word for computer, they do say computer, occasionally pasokon, which is personal computer, personal computer, pasokon. But in Chinese, no way. In Chinese, they say diannao, which means electronic brain. Rinse and repeat basically for every word. The Japanese will say forku for fork, the Chinese have their own word, etc. Knife in Japanese is knaifu, where the Chinese do use the Chinese word dao. So coming from a Western perspective, it's a little easier to learn Japanese from that point of view, but then again, very situational. Now, since we were talking about the learning curve in these languages, I think that's another major difference, in the sense that learning beginner level can be complex in Chinese because you need to spend so much time learning the pronunciation, and whereas in Japanese, you can, because the pronunciation is not too difficult to at least get yourself to be understood, then, you know, it's easier to kind of go through the beginner level. But as you reach intermediate level, in my experience, Japanese starts to become really problematic, where the Chinese starts to speed up. But then again, that's personal experience. As you reach the last part, so the kind of final level in both, when you reach a high level, even though they're both extremely difficult, I think the situation is swapped again. So when it comes to the learning curve, Chinese has a very steep learning curve. Japanese tends to be faster to learn, but then it becomes extremely steep. But at the end of the day, as we were saying, very much will depend on where you're coming from, what your first language is, what your experience is, if you are particularly talented towards pronunciation, or if you find pronunciation to be a stumbling block. And so in order to be able to answer the question properly, and as I say, one different answer per person, in order for you to identify what the answer is to this question for you specifically, you need to look at all of these things: grammar, vocabulary, comprehension, pronunciation, syntax, reading and writing. You need to look at each of these and see how much of a problem these can be for you. Are you a freaking grammar enthusiast and you love spending time learning grammar? Then that one is not going to be a problem for you. Perhaps you will like all of the different conjugations and different sentence structures and suffixes and particles in Japanese. Or maybe you are a pronunciation maniac and you absolutely love studying pronunciation. You would do that 24/7, then you're going to freaking love Chinese. Perhaps you have an artistic side and so you do enjoy the fact that the characters are more complicated because you really like the experience of the artistic section, and so you don't mind spending hours and hours trying to learn characters that are very complicated. In that case, I would say freaking pick up Taiwanese or Cantonese. Why not? Difficulty in language learning is very personal. There are some absolute categories, so we can absolutely say that pronunciation in a tonal language is going to be harder than pronunciation in a non-tonal language. With that being said, it's important to also underline though that when we do say this, as I was saying at the beginning of the video, we are really being reductive because yes, Japanese is not tonal, but it is pitch-based, not stress-based. So if you do come from a stress-based language like English or Italian, then learning a pitch-based language, if you really want to sound good, it's not going to be a walk in the park. Regardless, I think as a little introductory video to this topic, this should be enough for today, but please let me know your experience. Have you tried learning any of these? Have you tried learning both? What was your experience? Which one did you find to be harder for you? And please let me know your background. What's your first language and how many languages do you speak? Perhaps we could make this into a little mini series and try to go even deeper into perhaps making dedicated videos to each single one of these aspects. One video on the characters, one video on a comparative key, on grammar, one video on sentence structure. Today, I just mentioned these things, but I can go deeper if that's what you're interested in. Please let me know, and thank you very much for joining Metatrons Academy.